Black woman slapped by mother-in-law before friends. But her unexpected response shocked everyone. The sun had just begun its slow descent over Atlanta, casting an amber glow across the polished floors of the upscale Buckhead home where the family was gathering for what was supposed to be a pleasant Sunday afternoon dinner. Jasmine stood near the kitchen island, her hands carefully arranging the last of the hors d'oeuvres onto a porcelain tray with edges as sharp as the tension that had begun to hum beneath the surface. She was dressed in a sage green blouse and cream slacks, her long braids coiled into a high bun, her gold hoops catching the light every time she moved. Everything about her radiated grace, even now, even here, in the home that didn't feel quite like hers, among people who smiled with teeth but rarely warmth. It had been 3 years since she married Malcolm, her college sweetheart, the man who once stood on a cafeteria table and recited Audre Lorde just to ask her out. Their love had been real, raw, and defiant, especially in those early years when his mother, Elaine Whitmore, had made no secret of her disapproval. Jasmine had tried. Lord knows, she had tried. She remembered the first time she met Elaine. A tea brunch at the family's country club where Elaine barely made eye contact and only referred to Jasmine in the third person. "So, this is the girl, then," she'd said. Not woman. Not by name. Just girl. With the same tone someone might use when referencing a stain that wouldn't quite come out. But Jasmine had smiled. Had told herself that love would win out. That time would soften Elaine's edges, just as it had for her own grandmother who once doubted Malcolm because he was too pretty for his own good. Today, however, the house was full of people, Malcolm's colleagues from the firm, two of his mentors, and a handful of family friends whose eyes lingered a little too long on Jasmine's every move. Still, she smiled, made conversation, refilled glasses. She had always believed in carrying herself with dignity, even when others did not extend her the same. "Jasmine," came Elaine's voice, tight and deliberate, from across the room. "Would you be a dear and bring out the crab cakes? They're Malcolm's favorite, after all." There it was. The subtle jab. Jasmine had made grilled portobellos instead, knowing Malcolm had gone pescatarian last year. Elaine hadn't approved of the change, said it was a phase, and refused to acknowledge that her son's tastes, like his life, might evolve. But Jasmine turned, nodding gently. "They're right here," she said, lifting the tray. "And I made a little remoulade to go with them." Elaine walked over, her heels clicking with every step. She was dressed in a tailored white suit with gold buttons and a string of pearls that rested against her collarbone like a badge of some unspoken superiority. She took one look at the mushrooms, lifted an eyebrow, and then, in front of everyone, raised her hand and slapped the tray clean out of Jasmine's grasp. Gasps rippled through the room. Mushrooms hit the floor with a soft thud. The remoulade jar shattered near the baseboard. Silence expanded like a sudden pressure drop. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God." A fork clattered onto a plate in the dining room where guests had begun to edge closer, drawn in by the noise, by the drama they could now barely pretend not to see. And Jasmine stood still. She did not bend to pick up the food. She did not look away. Her chest rose slowly, then fell, then rose again. Elaine, whose hand now trembled slightly, looked as though she'd just realized the weight of what she'd done. But her chin remained high, her lips tight. "You need to learn your place," she said, her voice a little quieter now. "This isn't your home, and I won't let you humiliate my son in front of all these people with this nonsense." Jasmine tilted her head. Her eyes didn't narrow, didn't flicker with rage. Instead, she studied Elaine the way one might study a painting they'd walked past 1,000 times, but never really stopped to understand. And then, finally, Jasmine spoke. Her voice was steady, measured, but every syllable landed like a gavel. "You know," she said, brushing an invisible thread from her blouse, "I spent 3 days preparing this dinner. I cleaned this house top to bottom. Your house, after a 12-hour shift on Friday and another yesterday. I skipped brunch with my sister today so I could make sure your cousin Marjorie's allergies were accounted for. And I listened all afternoon as you corrected me in front of your friends, as you rolled your eyes at my every sentence, as you tried, again, to make me feel like I didn't belong. Her eyes scanned the room. The guests were frozen. Even Malcolm stood paralyzed, his glass of Pinot halfway to his lips, his expression unreadable. But this, Jasmine gestured calmly to the ruined tray on the floor. This is where you crossed the line. And I want you to know, I see you. I see the small ways you try to chip away at me. And I've let it slide because I thought love would be enough. I thought that if I just kept showing up with kindness, eventually you'd meet me there. She stepped forward, closing the space between them until the distance was no wider than a breath. But I don't owe you my silence, Elaine. Not anymore. The room remained silent. One of Malcolm's mentors, a woman in her 60s with bright silver hair, gave a barely perceptible nod. Elaine opened her mouth, but Jasmine gently raised a hand. No, she said. It's my turn to speak. And you're going to listen. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin, brittle line, the kind that cracked if one looked too closely. Around them, the silence thickened, but not like the silence of comfort or shared understanding. This was the kind that hums with tension, like the moment before a chandelier falls from the ceiling. Jasmine didn't step back. She didn't blink. Her voice was still calm, but the undertone had changed. It carried the gravity of years, of compromises, of a dignity sharpened through endurance. You want me to shrink in front of your friends, Jasmine continued, her voice still not raised, so they'll think I don't belong here. But I want you to understand something. I didn't marry into this family to be tolerated. I married Malcolm because we built something together, because we dreamed together and fought for that dream when all the noise tried to tell us it wouldn't survive. I have sat at this table, brought food to this house, supported your son in moments you never even knew about. She glanced briefly toward Malcolm, who now looked visibly conflicted, his brows pinched, jaw tight, but her gaze did not linger. Her focus remained on Elaine, who shifted slightly, just enough for Jasmine to see the faint flicker of something in her eyes. Regret? Fear? Or maybe just the discomfort of being called to account in front of those who were used to seeing her as a pillar of grace and control. You wanted your guests to see me embarrassed, Jasmine went on. But what they're seeing now is a woman who knows exactly who she is, who will no longer smile politely while being diminished. At that, one of the guests, a middle-aged man in a plaid blazer with a glass of bourbon in hand, cleared his throat awkwardly. I think maybe we should step outside for a minute. Give them some space. No, said Jasmine, calmly but with a quiet finality that surprised even her. No need. This house is big enough for honesty. She bent then, not out of submission, but with quiet grace, and began picking up the scattered food from the floor. One of the mushroom caps had landed under the edge of the marble island. Another had splattered near Elaine's pristine shoes. Jasmine moved methodically, her movements smooth, unshaken. She placed the broken jar gently into a trash bin near the sink, then wiped her hands and turned. Malcolm finally moved. Mom, he said, his voice raw, laced with the kind of tension that only years of unspoken frustration could create. What was that? Elaine's mouth opened, as if she might find a thread of justification, but all that came out was, she was disrespecting the traditions. No, Malcolm cut in. She wasn't. She made dinner. She planned this entire day. She's been holding everything together for weeks while I've been. He stopped, shook his head, and looked at Jasmine. I should have said something a long time ago. Jasmine's eyes didn't soften, not yet, but she gave a single, small nod, a gesture that said, I hear you. I see that you're trying. From the corner of the room, Elaine's cousin Marjorie spoke up, her voice high and proper. Perhaps we should all take a breath. It's been a long day and— No, Jasmine interrupted, her tone still gentle but firm. I think it's important we don't skip past this. Every time something like this happens, and it's not the first time, people want to smooth it over. Act like it was just tension or fatigue or family drama. But this wasn't drama. This was humiliation. This was disrespect in its most public form. And if we pretend it's normal, it becomes normal. There it was, the shift. People were starting to see it. Not just the guests, but Elaine herself. The perfect veneer of the Whitmore image, carefully curated over decades of charity galas and golf tournaments, now had a crack. And through that crack, truth was seeping in. Elaine finally spoke again. This time, her voice wasn't sharp. It was quieter, uncertain. I didn't mean to. I didn't think. You did, Jasmine said, but not cruelly. You did think. You've been thinking for years that I'm less than, that I should feel grateful to be here, in your house, with your name attached to mine. But I have a name too, a family, a story, and I brought all of that into this marriage with love. I've never asked you to change, Elaine, but I will not allow you to keep trying to erase me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one of the mentors, Mrs. Laverne Hart, a respected civil rights attorney with a powerful presence and a deep love for Southern cornbread, stood up from her seat and walked over to Jasmine. She placed a hand on her shoulder. "Well said, baby," she murmured, her voice rich like molasses. "Very well said." Jasmine smiled at her then, the first real smile since the slap. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was weary, but strong, the kind that grows after storms. Elaine still hadn't sat down. Instead, she turned and walked toward the hallway, retreating into one of the side rooms. Malcolm made a motion to follow her, but Jasmine caught his hand lightly. "Let her go," she said. "If she wants to understand what just happened, she'll have to sit with it." Malcolm looked at her, then nodded slowly. The rest of the dinner unfolded in a quiet, thoughtful rhythm. The guests, unsure of what to say, offered help cleaning. Someone reheated the baked yams. Another guest refilled the pitcher of lemonade. It wasn't a celebration, not exactly, but it wasn't broken either. It was something in between. Real. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the house was dim again, Jasmine stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the soft glow of the city lights. Malcolm approached her slowly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I'm sorry," he said into her shoulder, "for every time I didn't speak up." She closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet of the moment. "I know," she whispered. "But you did today," she added after a pause, "and that matters." They stood there for a long time, neither of them speaking, the house finally still. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, Elaine sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her own reflection in the vanity mirror, the echo of Jasmine's words playing over and over in her mind, not letting her look away. The morning after the dinner, the Whitmore house felt strangely hushed, as though the walls themselves were still processing what had taken place beneath the chandeliers and polished crown molding the night before. Jasmine woke early, not out of habit, but out of a restlessness that refused to let her sleep past dawn. She sat at the edge of their bed, sipping from a chipped ceramic mug Malcolm had given her back in college, the one with the faded text, "We fight with love." Malcolm stirred beside her. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, then looked at her with the kind of gaze that had become less common in recent months, unguarded, open. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Jasmine shook her head. "Too many thoughts. Too much. Unfinished air." He nodded. "You were incredible yesterday, Jazz." She didn't smile at that. "I shouldn't have had to be." That silenced him. And she didn't say it with blame, but rather a weary truth. Because there was no victory in what happened. No joy in having to defend her humanity in front of guests and relatives who, more often than not, saw her as a fixture in Malcolm's life, not a co-author of it. Downstairs, the kitchen carried the faint smell of lemon oil and leftover spices. Jasmine walked in to find Elaine already there, standing rigid by the counter, pouring tea into a cup with her hands as still as statues. She had not expected to see her mother-in-law, certainly not before 9 a.m., and definitely not standing there as though nothing seismic had taken place less than 12 hours earlier. Their eyes met. Elaine didn't look away. "Would you like some?" she asked, gesturing toward the pot. Jasmine paused, not because she didn't want tea, but because the question itself felt surreal in its normalcy. Still, she walked forward and took a cup from the cabinet, placing it quietly beside Elaine's. Chamomile, slightly oversteeped. They stood in silence for several seconds before Elaine spoke again. "I was raised in a house where women didn't raise their voices. They raised their standards. My mother used to say that we endure, and we endure, and we endure, until we are alone in our rooms, where no one can see the cracks." Jasmine listened without interrupting. Elaine's voice wasn't its usual polished steel. It carried something softer, like cloth stretched thin. "I've never been good at expressing softness," she went on, "especially not to women I feel threatened by." Jasmine's eyebrows lifted slightly. Elaine caught it. "I don't mean I'm afraid of you. I mean, I've watched you carry my son in ways I never could. I've seen him grow under your influence, become more open, more vocal. And I suppose part of me resented that." Jasmine's voice was even when she replied, "You thought I was changing him, when really, I was just helping him be more of himself." Elaine nodded, slowly, as though the idea was something she had always known deep down but never had the courage to say aloud. "I was wrong to touch you," she said, eyes dropping to the rim of her cup. "There is no excuse for it. I won't insult you by offering one." Jasmine let the silence stretch between them again. The room held its breath. Then she said, not unkindly, "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 3 years." Elaine blinked. Her fingers tightened briefly around her cup, then released. "I don't expect forgiveness," she murmured. "And I'm not offering it today," Jasmine said, not harshly, but firmly. "What I will offer is space. If you want to learn who I am, not the version you imagined, but the real me, you're welcome to try. But I won't perform for your approval anymore." Elaine gave a quiet nod. Not dramatic, not tearful, just a simple movement of the head that meant, understood. Later that day, Jasmine met with her best friend Nia at their favorite cafe on Peachtree Street, a small, black-owned spot with brick walls, local art, and a cinnamon latte that tasted like it had been touched by angels. "So," Nia said, taking off her sunglasses dramatically, "tell me everything. I heard from 3 people already, and every version was messier than the last." Jasmine exhaled. "It was intense. I heard she slapped the tray out your hands and tried to monologue like a soap villain." "She did," Jasmine said. "And I responded. Not with yelling. Just truth." Nia sipped her drink, eyebrows raised. "I've known you a long time, Jazz. And I've seen you go quiet in rooms you should have burned down. So tell me, what changed?" Jasmine looked out the window, where the sun was casting long golden stripes across the sidewalk. "I think I finally got tired of editing myself in places where I should be celebrated," she said. "I kept hoping if I just kept smiling, things would shift. But some people won't see you until you make them uncomfortable." Nia leaned back in her chair, clearly impressed. "And Malcolm?" "He stood up," Jasmine said. "Not immediately, but when it mattered." "You trust that?" Jasmine thought for a moment, then nodded. "I do. I trust him. I think he's growing too." Nia placed her hand over Jasmine's. "Good. Because you deserve a table where you don't have to shrink to fit. You're not built for corners, Jazz. You're built for light." That evening, Jasmine received a phone call from Elaine's sister, Aunt Valerie, the only Whitmore who had ever made Jasmine feel like more than a guest in her own life. "I heard about the incident," Valerie said carefully. Word travels fast. You handled it with grace, she said. Not many would have. And I just wanted to say, thank you. For staying. For still showing up. Jasmine's voice was soft. I didn't do it for the family. I did it for myself. Well, Valerie chuckled gently. Sometimes that's exactly what the family needs. Someone who remembers who they are, even when everyone else forgets. As the call ended and the evening settled in, Jasmine stood at the threshold of something unfamiliar. Not peace, not yet, but possibility. The kind that comes only after a boundary is drawn and held with quiet strength. And while Elaine sat alone in her own room, nursing the quiet realization that her house had been changed forever by one afternoon, Jasmine lay next to Malcolm, her hand in his, her voice low as she whispered, I didn't want a war. I just wanted respect. To which Malcolm, staring at the ceiling, said gently, then let's keep building a home where you never have to ask for it again. The weeks that followed moved slowly, not with the numb pace of denial or silence, but with the kind of quiet where things could settle, rearrange themselves, and take on new shapes. Jasmine wasn't naive enough to believe a single confrontation would rewrite years of dismissals, or that Elaine would emerge suddenly enlightened, embracing her with open arms and warm compliments. But change, she had learned, rarely roars. It often whispers, then waits to be noticed. Elaine didn't return to her usual icy composure. In fact, for the first time since Jasmine had known her, she grew quiet not out of superiority but reflection. She didn't offer apologies laced with excuses, and Jasmine didn't offer forgiveness wrapped in performance. But there was something else beginning to bloom, the smallest root of mutual recognition. One Saturday morning, Malcolm was in the garage fixing a leaky sink valve when Jasmine heard a knock at the front door. She opened it to find Elaine standing there with a container of homemade lemon bars. I know you're not big on sweets, she said, but my mother taught me that you can't have a real conversation without something warm on the table. Jasmine hesitated, not from bitterness, but from sheer surprise. She stepped aside and let her in. They sat in the sunroom, the lemon bars untouched between them. Through the wide windows, the magnolia tree swayed gently, its blossoms like porcelain cups caught mid-bloom. I've been thinking about something, Elaine said slowly, hands resting in her lap. About how much of my life was built around control. Maintaining it. Protecting it. I never realized how tightly I gripped things until I saw you. Not flinch. Jasmine looked at her, not speaking. Elaine continued. That night, when you looked me in the eye, even after I'd done something unforgivable, you didn't retaliate. You just stood there, rooted. And I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not defiance. Not submission. Just power. There was a silence that stretched long but didn't feel awkward. Jasmine finally broke it. I didn't stand there for you, Elaine. I stood there for the little girl I used to be. The one who watched women shrink in front of respectable people and called it grace. I needed her to see that it's okay to speak, to be seen. Elaine nodded, her throat visibly tight. I see her, and I see you. They talked. About Jasmine's childhood. About Elaine's own strict upbringing. About the loneliness that clings to women who are only ever praised for being strong. They didn't solve everything, but for once, they weren't pretending. Later that month, Jasmine received an invitation in the mail, engraved, formal, with her name written properly and beautifully, Jasmine Whitmore. It was a luncheon hosted by the local Civic League, and it listed her as the keynote speaker. She looked at Malcolm, surprised. I didn't sign up for this, she said. No, he smiled. But your name was submitted. By someone who said your voice deserved to be heard. Jasmine turned the card over. On the back, in elegant cursive, was a note. For the woman who stood and made others see. E. She felt the lump in her throat before the tears arrived. She wiped her cheek, looked at Malcolm, and whispered, It's not about a slap. It never was. I know, he said. It was about being erased and reclaiming your place. On the day of the luncheon, Jasmine stood at the podium, the afternoon light cutting through the tall windows of the community center, dust motes dancing in gold. People leaned forward in their chairs, waiting. She took a breath, then spoke. There are moments in life that split you open. Not violently, not loudly, just cleanly, like a thread pulled from a fine seam. And in that opening, you decide, will I fold inward or will I expand into something fuller? She paused, letting the room breathe with her. I stood before someone who tried to make me smaller. And instead of shrinking, I remembered who I was. And I spoke, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because silence was starting to hurt me. Applause rose gently, then fully. In the back row, Elaine stood. And when Jasmine's eyes met hers, there was no bitterness. Only the quiet acknowledgement that something real had been exchanged, not peace in the traditional sense, but truth, which was better. And when Jasmine walked off the stage, the weight she carried wasn't gone, but it was different now. Lighter. Shared. She wasn't just the woman who stood tall after being struck. She was the woman who changed the room by refusing to disappear.